go over today is what is MPD 150? What do we do? Understanding some key concepts of defund versus abolition versus reform. We're going to do a visioning exercise about moving toward a police free world. And I'm going to offer you all some resources and optional homework for those of you who like to do homework. And I just wanted to say, we won't be able to answer every question today, and that's okay. Policing, safety, transforming the way we make healthy communities is a big issue. And definitely we can't even begin to unravel it in 20 minutes, but this will hopefully provide a good foundation for you all moving forward in the series and offer some directions for getting deeper. So that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to open it up with a video here. And this is a video, I believe it's from Interrupting Criminalization, and it gives some history of the police and also an overview of what defund really means. Oh, go back. Let me know.
People have a lot of opinions about policing, and our ideas about policing are shaped by our race, our genders, our class, and our parents. For example, most white people have very little interaction with police. In a recent study, 77% of white people had no contact with police in the previous year. Of those who did, at least half were traffic stops. And in many cases, white people initiated contact by calling the police. Since they have little unwanted contact, many white people's opinions about policing are not based on personal experience. Dominant culture, especially mass media, sells us the image of officer friendly, but whose experience is that actually based on? The same study found that Black people experience excessive force at the hands of police at more than twice the rate of white people. Did we have a just and equitable police force and something went wrong? No. Policing in the South emerged from the slave patrols in the 17 and 1800s that caught and returned runaway enslaved people. In the West, police departments were formed to keep Native people out of cities built by white settlers. And in the North, the first municipal police departments in the mid-1800s helped quash labor strikes and riots against the rich, and policed public spaces to conform to middle-class white morality around gender and sexuality and exclude poor, unhoused, or disabled people. Policing in the US began as a system of economic, social, racial, patriarchal, and ableist control. And that is what it still is today. The truth is police don't do what most people think they do. Police spend more than half of their time responding to non-criminal calls and traffic issues, and only 1% to 3% of their time responding to violent crime calls. Police don't stop violence. They respond to violence that has already occurred, and they respond with their own threat of violence. And that response is not equitable. When people of color are involved, police often engage violently. Yet we spend an astronomical amount of money on the police, over $100 billion a year. Let that sink in. The demand to defund the police is about minimizing the role and power of police in our society. It's about demanding that the government stop writing blank checks for racist control, containment, and punishment. Defunding the police is also about recognizing that police do not solve or address any social issues. They do not prevent harm. What if we took that $100 billion and invested it in our community? What if we had housing, access to healthy food and clean water, health care, healing, cooperative businesses, education, child care, parks, art, and community services? If you already have those things, great. But that's not the reality everywhere. Ask yourself, if we have the resources, why doesn't everyone have this?
All right, so that was actually from Project NIA. And that's just a little overview of what defund means. And what defund means is divesting from policing and investing in the things that promote safety, like housing, healthcare, um, good food, livable wages, etc. And I dropped the link to that video in the chat as well if you want to go back and read through it again or look for references. So who's MPD 150? Here's a cute photo of me and Ricardo Levins Morales tabling at Open Streets a couple of years ago. So MPD 150 is a group of activists, organizers, and artists who came together in 2017 on the 150th anniversary of the Minneapolis Police Department. And we decided that after 150 years, it was time for a performance review of the police. So we did what we call a people's evaluation of the police department. And we wrote this report that's on the right here, Enough is Enough. And what we did basically was write a history that hadn't been written before, right? A compilation of the history, not only of police violence in Minneapolis, but also of attempted and failed reform, and captured that all in one place. And also the history of resilience, of community fighting against police violence, mass incarceration, and surveillance, as well as community alternatives, ways of keeping one another safe. So we wrote this report. It is divided into the past, present, and future. So also includes interviews with over 80 community members and then ideas for alternatives moving into the future. We released that in 2017. In 2018, we turned it into an art exhibit, which we called Making It Real, Steps Towards a Police-Free Future. And then in this last year, in 2019, actually, I think, maybe it's this year. What is time now, you know? We made this comic book, which we called Community Policing and Other Fairy Tales. And that gets to this idea that they touched on in the video of officer friendly, which is community policing. You can learn the full history in the comic book, but it dates back to after militant Black Power and other movements were quashed in the 60s and 70s. The establishment came up with this idea of community policing as a way to paint a friendlier face on the state. But it in fact, again, took resources out of actual services for community and forced them to be funneled through the police instead, and came coupled with increased surveillance in communities. So you can learn all about the history in that. And we decided to do it as a comic book because these can be very kind of heady concepts. And we were like, how can we make this as accessible as possible? So we worked with local artists. A group of high schoolers from South High School wrote one of the comics that are in there. Very cool. So that's a little bit about who we are. We're about shifting the story and we're about history. So we don't do like policy work or direct action. It's more about providing a historical perspective and shifting ideas of what's possible. So MPD 150 is an abolitionist organization. So what does abolition mean in the terms of policing? Abolition means, this is a definition from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and it says abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And what we mean by that is abolition is saying that in order to have safe and healthy communities, we need to make sure that everyone has their basic needs met, right? Most crime is not random. Most crime happens because people don't have their basic needs met, whether it's not having a safe place to stay, not being able to afford rent, not being able to get a good job, getting fired for a job for bogus reasons, whatever it is, all contributes to what is the majority of crime, right? Which is property crime. And even if we look at more complex things like interpersonal violence, that also can trace back to a lack of good education about healthy relationship skills in schools, right? And we've seen attacks on comprehensive sex ed, teaching people from a young age how to relate to one another in healthy and kind ways and communicate, right? So abolition is about building up the things we need to live and reducing and eventually eliminating the need for policing, right? Addressing the core conditions that lead to the need for police. And why do we talk about abolition? So we made this graphic here, which we called the futile cycle of police reform. And I think we're in this moment right now. So I can read through this here. It starts with police brutality or murder, leads to outrage and protest, and the cycle goes that it turns into police reform and then into stagnation and backsliding. And we saw that here, right? We saw that. This was June. This was the whole summer, outrage and protest. We didn't even really see police reform this year. We saw some task forces maybe pop up. And then stagnation, right? When we saw this year's, I don't know how much you all pay attention to city budgets, but if you're paying attention, you probably saw some stagnation and backsliding this year. And then it led right to brutality and murder. So we offer abolition as a way out of that. Abolition is saying that the police cannot be reformed away from their core function, which is to protect whiteness and wealth. And the only way for us to have safe and healthy communities is to address those core conditions that lead to harm being caused. And I know these are really big concepts, and if you're not an abolitionist, I'm probably not going to convince you in these 20 to 25 minutes, but I do want to offer an introduction to the concept and then encourage you to read more from MPD 150's resources to really dig into these questions. So if you're like, whoa, I have a million questions about this, good, that's normal. And also, don't think I'm trying to convince you in this one moment, but I think you will come along in the journey with us in the long term. So, okay, what about, I circled abolition. So what about police reform, right? We've talked a lot about reform, civilian review councils, body cameras, use of force policies, implicit bias trainings. Minneapolis is the poster child for police reform, right? We have all of these things. And yet still we see last week police murder and violence happening and across the country too, right? Reform has happened all across the board, and we have police in DC right now. Anyway, I digress. So I'm going to offer these words from my comrade Tony Williams, who spoke, and this is from a 2018 hearing, to speak really why police reform is not the answer. And this is about 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Oh no, come back. I'll see if I can turn on subtitles too.
Welcome. Yeah, hi, my name is Tony Williams. I live in Councilmember Reich's ward. So first, I want to draw attention to this altar of victims of police brutality we have of the Minneapolis Police Department. From listening to a lot of the speakers tonight, you would think that the police department doesn't do anything other than play sports with kids. And we here have a lot of evidence that that's not the case. So I want to name some of the folks that we have pictured here. Courtney Williams, Barbara Schneider, Dominic Felder, Quincy Smith, Justine Damon, Travis Jordan, Terrence Franklin, Jamar Clark, Thurman Blevins. We honor them. So we got one of the emails that the police sent in order to turn out people for the hearing tonight. And here are basically the things that it said. So it said, if there's a divestment from the department, and I do support a 5% divestment from the police department, said any police service not 911 related will stop. Said the Police Activities League will be disbanded. It said the community engagement team will cease to exist. And it said the expansion of group violence intervention, which is not funded through the police department, will not happen. So I think it says a lot that when we talk about a $30 million expansion in the budget over the last 5 years, that the second that there's any talk of divestment of anything from the department, they immediately threaten to cut all the wonderful programs that get people out here to talk about how great the police department is. This is why we shouldn't be funding these programs within the department, because the second that we try to take away any of their money for guns or SWAT, the 2.5 million expansion for the special operations that's in the budget this year, they immediately turn around and threaten to cut all of the programming. So I guess the question really is, how important is that programming to them if that's immediately what's on the chopping block the first second that they turn around? That email ended. Change is a process that occurs over time. So how much time is that exactly? So Tony Buzzo was hired as the great reformer of the department in 1980. He left in 1989, said the department was a bunch of thumpers when he came in, was a bunch of thumpers when he left. He put out editorial in Southside Pride 2 years ago that said that he had failed to reform the department. Janae Harteau, our first chief of color, our first queer chief, hired to be the great reformer of the department in 2012, left in 2017, fired because culture change wasn't happening enough. Now we have Chief Arredondo, an officer who actually sued the department for white supremacy, naming one particular officer as the most racist officer on the force, Bob Kroll. Bob Kroll was reappointed by the rank and file in 2017 with a 2-to-1 vote. So when you start talking about culture change, when you start trying to talk about shifting the culture of this department, we need to understand that that's been tried for decades and decades. No one has succeeded so far, and no one will, because the second anybody pushes back on them, they send every email that they can to turn out people based on their few community support programs. So I am asking for a 5% divestment, and I am really thankful to the council for being willing to think critically and not just listen to what you're told by the department about the ways to keep our city safe. Thank you.
All right. He convinces me every time. So, and what a different world, right? We were just asking for 5% that year, and everyone was like, that's crazy. And now across the world this summer, people demanded 50% divestments from their police department. So really shows the possibility of change. So how do we get there, right? Maybe you're convinced by now abolition sounds like a good idea, or yeah, I don't think we need as much money for police, but how do we get there practically speaking? I have an activity for you. And even if you're watching this recording at home, I encourage you to do this activity too. So if you have, I should have told you at the beginning, get a piece of paper and a pen, or if you can draw on your computer, there's like that Google, whatever it's called. Grab a piece of paper and a pen, and I'll give you 1 minute to get ready. Okay, so when you have your paper and pen, you're going to draw a police station at the center of your paper. Oh, great. Thank you, Jenna. Dropped a digital drawing tool if you want to use that. So the activity is this. This is what we call the spiderweb activity. You're going to draw a police station at the center of your paper, and then draw lines out to all the places in Minneapolis or in Prospect Park where you see police. So for example, I put a hospital here, and then just brainstorm where are all the places that you see police or you know police are regularly. So do that. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do that. Brainstorm as many places as possible. All right, let's get started sharing back. So drop in the chat, what are some of the places that you see police? The park, the airport, the light rail station, transit, schools, right? Big stores, yes, the gas station, government buildings, pulled up on Nicollet Mall, driving the streets. Yep, on the campus, they have their own police. Pulling up on Black folks, the courthouse, events, restaurants. Oh, they come to your neighborhood meetings, I'm sure. Yeah. Protests, yep. So I wrote, these are my clip art examples here. So some places I saw parks, shopping malls, transit, festivals, the hospital, neighborhoods. So the next part of the activity is think about all these places in the community, Target, wherever, that are police. Where are places that we can get rid of police today? Like we just straight up don't need to have an officer with a gun at those places. And go ahead and put an X through one of the lines or through the lines where you don't need police today. And if there's places where we need to develop an alternative, put a circle in those lines. And once you've done your X's, drop in the chat where are some of the places that you crossed off. School, yep. The store. Public transit, the hospital. Yeah. Yeah, so the shopping places, exactly. Yep. So the purpose of this exercise is to kind of like break down this monolith idea of the police, right? Because the police do a lot of more things than walking their beat or driving around town or responding to 911 calls. In fact, the majority of what they do is not those things, right? And so we're starting to see some moves. Shout out current council moving some theft calls out of 911 and into 311. So we're not sending police into communities just because, you know, there was property theft, right? Because we know that puts people at risk by having increased police presence. And also, frankly, is like very expensive to taxpayers. The average cost of a police officer in Minneapolis is $58 an hour. So imagine how many police officers you saw during the uprising standing around or brutalizing people. And if you're a math person, $58 per hour times 8 hours out times 100 officers out, like that's how much money we paid for that, right? So, okay, so I hope this was a helpful exercise for you to think about, you know, where are we starting? So when you talk about defund, we're not saying we're going to turn off the police overnight, right? That would be like saying, okay, I want clean energy, so I'm going to shut down every coal plant today, and then we'll figure it out from there. It's about a process, right? It's about building up alternatives. And I saw in the future of your series, you're also going to be talking with the Office of Violence Prevention and others about alternatives. We can talk about mental health response teams. There's a whole host of things that get to short-term and long-term safety building. And it's not all simple, right? So here are my suggestions for going forward, and then I'm going to open it up to questions, and then I think it's breakout time. How am I doing on time, folks? Yeah, okay. Great. So if you're short on time or you don't like reading things, I would recommend checking out the MPD 150 frequently asked questions about police abolition. I will drop all of these links in the chat. So it's just 8 points, I believe, and it really answers, for me, even the most skeptical family members in my life have been like, oh, I never thought about it that way, or oh, that was really helpful in understanding how we can move away from policing. So I would encourage you to start there. You can read it in 10 minutes. If you like activities, I made you a worksheet. So there's a link to a worksheet. There's a link to a worksheet on this Google Doc that's called the Building Alternatives worksheet. And I will just briefly screen share it to walk you through that you can do it on your own time. And so this one, where's my little screen share button? Here we go. So this is a worksheet to take you through, okay, let's break down what are the issues that police currently respond to. So you thought of some of those places where we see police. Well, why are we putting them there? So for example, one issue could be police are on transit because they have to enforce people paying the fare on transit. And this worksheet takes you through, okay, how do the police currently handle that? They might arrest people, fine people, they might assault or harass people on the train or the bus, or go beyond their authority. For example, a couple of years ago, we saw a transit officer who asked someone about their immigration status and actually ended up getting that person deported, which is definitely not in their purview of checking fares. So how do the police handle it now? What's an alternative solution? So one that we could make happen right now. So for this issue, we could enforce transit fares without police. So for example, turnstiles. And how can we prevent this issue from happening in the first place? Free transit for everyone. That's a solution, right? So this is, if you like this sort of intellectual exercise, this is a good worksheet to go through and just really break down what are other ways that we could respond in our neighborhood, even on your block. And then I'd also encourage you to check out, you can see the purple slide right now, right? Yeah, okay, great. Y'all are paying attention. Thanks for nodding. Check out the MPD 150 report. So it's such a great resource. It's available online. You can pick up copies at Ricardo's Art Studio in Longfellow if you like a physical copy. You can also download it online. You can also listen to it as an audio report read by some local poets. And then the new expanded version has some worksheets in the back. If you know educators, it has a curriculum, companion curriculum for middle and high school students. And we also have a huge resources page that talks all about alternatives to policing, abolition, all of that. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and open it up to some questions here.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That was awesome. Yeah, if anyone wants to write out a question, or feel free to speak up if it's easier for you to voice, or preferable for you to voice your question. Then yeah, let's open it up.
I have a really general question, Sheila. I'm fascinated by this idea of 150 years of police, and you did a deep dive into Minneapolis Police Department history. Just generally, what were some things from that historical perspective that stood out to you that are maybe fun or not so fun facts, trends we should be aware of, key moments that stick with you? What stands out?
Excellent question. One thing that really surprised me is, okay, guessing game. How many civilian review councils do you think Minneapolis has had, or civilian oversight committees? You can hold up a number. Okay, someone said 0, 0. Cam, you're cheating. Yeah, we've had five civilian review councils. So every time you hear like, we need more we need a new civilian oversight body. Like, I promise you, we have tried that. And while in principle, yes, sounds like a very good idea, what happens is that the powers of policing and those who support policing, like Bob Kroll, go and take away any teeth that these councils have, right? They don't have the power to fire officers. You know, the union contract is ridiculous. Even as we saw in this case of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, right? Even when officers like very clearly commit egregious harm, holding them accountable through the courts just doesn't happen, right? The system protects itself. So that was something that stood out to me where it was like, oh my, we've had 5. So in a lot of ways, it brought up how we have been the poster child for police reform, and how a lot of reforms that in principle seem like good ideas just don't actually change things, and how we've seen the same crimes committed over and over and over again by police, and the same harm at the cost of millions of dollars that like directly comes out of being able to be spent on things that keep people alive, you know, straight up. I see someone's hand raised. Sorry, I have so many tabs open.
I had raised mine, lower it down. Sorry about that. I was wondering, in my conversations as well, it keeps trickling back to the Federation. And I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I haven't gotten my hands on a MPD 150 yet, but I'm looking forward to getting that and kind of like, you know, getting in bed with it. But I'm wondering ahead of that, is there anything outlined in your work of ideas on how to deal with and or not transform, abolish, what have you, the police federation, as well as, what is his name, the lawyer for them, as well as for the park board? Is there a,
Brian, right?
you know, what do we know, right? What do we know about that situation and his him being some of the glue that keeps us stuck? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the police federation is a huge issue, and their contract is like crazy tight right now, and is now over a year expired. I mean, they're still operating under the old contract, but there are other groups who have gone deeper into the contract than MPD 150 has. But I know that there's a growing national movement that will actually be kicking off in January for a whole national push against police unions. And that's being led by, I think it's being led by Interrupting Criminalization or the Community Resource Hub. I'll write those in here. So look for that. Right, because we're restricted in what we can do in policing in a few ways. One is the Federation and their ability to keep police from being taken off the force. Another is in the current charter, which has a minimum number of police required, which was in fact put there by the Federation. So those are two barriers to reductions in policing.
Sheila, I have a question from Lynn that is, what % of the police budget is spent responding to people with mental health issues and homelessness?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have that off the top of my head. Maybe if someone does, you can drop it in the chat. Otherwise, I can look it up. And we had this great work group in the city called the 911 MPD work group. And what they did is pulled data on 911 response calls and what percentage of time was spent on what. But I'm not sure for that specific one, I can look that up and send it afterwards.
Any other questions, or there's chat questions out there?
Another chat question. How is or has policing been enacted differently in Minneapolis versus St. Paul?
I will say that on the whole, there are not huge variations of how policing is enacted in any city in America. As we're seeing, that's the reason we saw a nationwide and worldwide revolution happen this summer, right? Because the same core principles of policing, protecting white folks and property over brown and Black and Indigenous lives, it runs through. And that gets to our deeper assertion as MPD 150 that the police cannot be reformed away from that core function, and that to stay safe, instead, we need to concentrate on meeting our basic needs in a big way and taking those, what was it, $100 billion and moving that into community.
The next question in the chat is, and if people who are posting these want to ask them, you can jump in, interrupt me if you want. One question, and I don't know if this is a question for Sheila, Peter, but a question to ask of our park board: why are they hiring the same attorney as the police union? I don't know if that was theoretical or, yeah. Another question.
I was meaning to answer the question that wasn't necessarily a question of Sheila, but if people were concerned that we shouldn't be hiring them, the appropriate place to ask that question would, and we don't have direct control of the police union, but we do, the park board answers to us. So we could ask our park commissioners. That's what I meant.
Next question is from Laura. On the feudal cycle of reform, you mentioned how reform efforts are not working, such as body cameras, implicit bias training, and more. Did MPD put forth a way to evaluate those efforts? Do they think those reforms worked or not? It feels like cultural change has to happen for reforms to work. Are there examples from other police departments in the nation where reforms have worked?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think maybe the body cameras are some of the most illustrative answers, right? So the concept behind body cameras is that police will not behave corruptly or with aggression or brutality because they know they're being watched, right? But in fact, what we saw last week, right, shows that everyone had their body cameras on and still de-escalation was not the go-to tactic, right? And we saw that also with George Floyd's murder and Jacob Blake's and so many others, whether it's body cameras or Facebook footage or whatever, being watched is not enough to stop police from hurting people. And so I think in terms of evaluation, like that has shown that it has failed in those ways. And again, it gets to this question of, is culture change within policing possible, or is the institution of policing inherently based in racism and violence? And this gets to this bigger problem of the difference between the system of policing and how it's designed and individual officers, right? Like, I am not here to debate good cops versus bad cops, good apples versus bad apples, right? It's about the whole system. And that's why we're having a national conversation too, right? It's not just about individuals. And as far as I've seen, and in the work of MPD 150 and Reclaim the Block, reforming the system of policing itself has not worked. And Tony referenced that in that video as well, right? Minneapolis has had great reformer chiefs who even maybe make some changes during their chiefdom. But by the time they're out, someone else can come in and revert back. And what we see is the through line of what policing does. And these are the core principles of protecting whiteness and wealth, and also continuing to terrorize and murder poor and Black and brown folks.
We got time for one more question. Start a good one in the chat.
Just comment. I wanted to really second what the gentleman said about the police federation. And there's another aspect to that I was listening on public radio to what has happened to police training that has been limited largely for financial reasons as resources go elsewhere, which then leaves a void that the police federation can step into and provide an entirely different kind of training than the de-escalation that was more sought after here within the 40, 50 years ago.
And I think too, we've seen changes in training and increased implicit bias training and community policing. Also, the model of community policing gets to this idea of like be a more gentle police force. And we've also seen the resilience of violence in policing throughout all of those changes in training. So that's why we advocate for thinking about that spider web of like, okay, let's think before we try to like reform police into being more like social workers, where are the spots where we can just have social workers do that job? Or we don't need police to be in this situation at Target, whatever, that they do escalate a situation and like breaking down from there, if that makes sense. Oh, and I'd love to answer this last question about living outside the city. This is one of my favorite ones. Actually, it statistically does not make a difference whether a police officer lives inside or outside the city, does not affect rates of police violence, nor does levels of having more police or fewer police. Statistically speaking, I'm a nerd. Statistically speaking, the only predictor of changes in crime rates or changes the only predictor of changes in police violence are percentage of Black people who live in the community, which again speaks to the history of racism in policing.
Looks like we have two quick follow-up questions and one of them just got answered. So Laura, do you want to ask your quick question and then we can move into breakout groups?
On the reform, I think part of it was wondering too, trying to understand if the police department themselves, like what's their status of thinking about their reforms? Like if unacceptable things are happening, are they thinking that their reforms are working? Or are they thinking that their reforms aren't working and then wanting to try something different? I'm just curious if you've learned or seen anything more related to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, like Tony said, the rank and file reelects Bob Kroll 2-1. So I think that speaks to a desire to staying with the status quo. I think we also saw, over 100 officers quit this summer because of the protests. And I think that also speaks to the issue of, are you down for culture change and reform in the department? Yeah, that's kind of what I've seen happen. And we've also seen tremendous increase in budgets for militarization of the police, which is like its whole own workshop. But overall, in the last 6 years, MPD's budget has increased $40 million. So just imagine what like any nonprofit could have done with $40 million versus what we've seen in changes in how the police behaved in 2014, 15 to now,
I had a quick question here. Do you know the percentage of the Police Federation membership that is actually policemen?
don't know that. That's a good question, and I'm going to look it up after this workshop.
Time, and I do want to hear this poem. So if group facilitators can, we want to go around really quick and just share a big takeaway from your group. I can start with mine. We were really, we talked a lot about how defunding seems like this negative concept, but it's actually a really exciting way to think about a massive budget that could be cleared up and opened to so many new things. Like this idea of $100 billion that could be allocated in so many exciting and different ways. That's really fun to think about. There's so much potential. Sheila, do you want to talk about your group?
Yeah, we talked about the question of safety and comfort and how it's possible to feel very uncomfortable and yet feel totally safe at the same time. And there's definitely a distinction between those.
Great.
In
Yep.
my group, we talked a lot about how to provide a sense of safety and comfort and maybe reassurance to each other as a neighborhood. And I think Lynn had some good thoughts about that, and Claire had a really good summary. If Claire, you would be willing to share what you said.
Yeah, we talked a bit about how often police are used as sort of an after the fact, come in and they make people who have experienced some sort of harm or shock feel safer. They offer reassurance of some kind. And so the trick is to get people who maybe have experienced harm or maybe need to experience that kind of reassurance, finding a way to build that reassurance as a community with each other rather than by calling an outside source and having them come in.
Sweet. Kira, do you want to talk about your group?
Yeah, sure. One thing that we talked about for a while was something that was brought up before, that Bob Crow was reelected by a 2-to-1 vote, and how there's the culture who wanted to reelect him, that was 2, and the people who didn't, which was 1, and how can we shift that so the people who think he should be gone are the majority. And we feel like that might be a point where the culture could shift, because that's a huge issue with the systemic problems, and just beginning in even the training stages. So yeah.
Great. Who else had a group? I'm missing the list in front of me.
So our group talked about the difference between safety and comfort too, and I think Sarah summarized it best for us. So if you're willing to talk about it.
Yeah, we talked about how this presentation, Sheila, you did such a good job of identifying the distinction between police and safety, that they aren't one and the same, but we've been conditioned to believe that they're the same. And we just talked about how that really stood out for us in this presentation, that police and safety are different and there's other ways of achieving safety.
Nice, well said. Any other groups want to share?
Ben, our group talked about how safety, our perception of safety exists within a really complicated intersection of our identities as a human, and needing to not demonize people for having different different identities and having different conceptions of safety, but recognizing that safety and comfort are different, and trying to find a common point within a group of humans, whether it is a neighborhood or a city. Yeah, and really quick point for reform, defund, abolition, that difference. I think one thing that I hadn't thought about is that reform often means that there is more money added to a budget. And I don't know if Sheila can talk more to that, but defund and abolition usually means taking some money away. And I had never really thought about that, but I thought that was a really important point.
Nice. Ami, did you have a group? Or was there another group that wanted to share? Do we get everyone? I think. If anyone else has a result from a small group that they want to share, share it in the chat or shout it out. I want to pose one last question before we go, which is one that brings this home to our neighborhood and in our community in Prospect Park. So the question is, what actions can we take as individuals and as a neighborhood to build on what we learned in this workshop? How can we use what we talked about and learned about tonight and make this community a more inclusively safe place? If anyone wants to shout something out, please do. If you feel more comfortable sharing in the chat, please do that. But let's open the floor to any thoughts. How can we? I'll share the question in the chat. Sam says we should attend next week's meetings. That's
a quick plug.
Yep, we've got 5 more of these and they're all going to be amazing.
I'll second that. Attend all the remaining 4 and maybe be active in PPA and make your voice known and talk to your neighbors so that I think through conversation where people get a chance to talk about their concerns and their fears and you talk about what you learned is a good way for things to change, is to be active in your community and in your neighborhood.
I'll kind of go out on a limb here a little bit. I think that Prospect Park struggles with its white privilege and including genuine diversity. We have a neighborhood of almost 10,000 residents, and the neighborhood association is overwhelmingly white and about 100 people. A very, very deep and complicated question, but a very, very important one.
If I could add, I agree, Richard. Thank you very much. We have Glendale, which encompasses, which is an overwhelming diverse community, but is also made up of a community that may perhaps have less experience in forums like this, and we either will or won't take an interest in cultivating their success so that they can participate. Prospect Park has never really done that at all.
Actually, Loudon was here for a while and we were in a meeting today with Kaha. And so there actually are some, I'm not disagreeing with anybody. There's quite a bit of efforts going on in Prospect Park Association now that are really different than in the past. So
absolutely,
I'd encourage people to get involved. Things are changing and they're only going to change if you get involved.
I take a look at my own journey when I was young, my first board, walking in there and saying, what is going on here? Not knowing Robert Rules of Orders. And this is a less formal experience. And
we don't use that anymore. And I know we were at the renters group together a lot.
Regardless of what governance we use to come up with these forums and offshoots or whatever, if people don't have experience in their background, I was fortunate where someone said, hey, plus nobody else wanted the role. Hey, we'll mentor you. But there's a lot of potential in Glendale.
Yeah, seeing some abolish Robert's rules comments. Yeah, I'm super excited about this more informal space where we can share. Any other thoughts in our community?
I was going to say about our communities, we can just think about, you know, what the police keep showing at the council is that they are getting more and more calls. So individually, we have to think about what are our alternatives to calling 911, knowing that the police are going to be the ones who respond. So I think we could each take it upon ourselves to do a better job of trying to conflict resolve and just thinking about whether or not that situation, because it can turn deadly for people. So.
Yeah, well said.
I just want to jump in. I've got to head out here. I'm sorry, but I wanted to thank you very, very much for doing this. This has been incredible and very, very helpful, and I look forward to the others. So thank you and have a good evening.
Good night, Richard.
This is Laura. I was going to build on what Cody was saying and what someone said earlier. I really appreciated the group that summarized that idea about people needing reassurances. And so instead of seeking that from police, that we would seek that from each other as a community. That was a really, really great summary statement from that group. And so I'm struck by the idea of just the action of just like knowing our actually immediate neighbors better. You know, if everyone sort of really knows that people and we're able to support each other as a community, then if people are having questions of feeling safety, if you know the people around you, then you get your reassurance from your neighbors instead. And I really appreciated how that group talked about it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. See a call for building up systems of mutual aid in the chat from Devin. We need a whole new discussion to build on that idea, but yes, absolutely. Ami says to follow the leadership of abolitionists in our community. Yeah, I totally second that one too. It is 7 o'clock and there are so many more ideas that we have to share and that I'd love to hear. And luckily, as has been mentioned, we've got one of these every Wednesday for the next 4 weeks to continue to share them. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. Thank you so much, Sheila, for guiding us through this and giving us some fresh ideas and perspectives. Thank you to everyone who helped facilitate and organize. Thank you, Sam and Madeline, for taking care of technical things that I hate doing. You did great. And yeah, let's turn it back over to Sheila, who has got a poem to share with all of us.
Okay, yeah.
Sounds great.
This is the poem I read to myself when I'm feeling overwhelmed, like on days when white supremacists take over Congress or whatever. So it's by March Piercy. It's called The Low Road. And it goes, what can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up. They can bust you. They can break your fingers. They can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone, you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity and your own newsletter. 10,000 power and your own paper. 100,000 your own media. 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again and they said no. It starts when you say we and you know who you mean. And each day you mean one more. That's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.